And so welcome, Katie. Take it on. Stage is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, I'm excited to share this project with you. It's research I've been doing for my master's thesis, as Anna just said, using multi-scale remote sensing to examine spatial variation in ice wedge degradation. So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators, both at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Illinois, as well as the UW Graduate School Fellowship that supported me doing this work. So we're going to start with a short introduction to ice wedge landscapes and also ice wedge degradation and degradation stages, then talk about multi-scale mapping, the multi-scale mapping that I did for this project, and then talk about some of my findings, first looking at spatial variation in ice wedge degradation, and then looking at landscape patterns related to that degradation, before finishing with some conclusions and main takeaways. So ice wedge landscapes cover a large portion of the Arctic, 65% of the Arctic coastal plain in Alaska. And if you're unfamiliar, this is what these landscapes look like. You might be able to see, if you can see right here, there's a little person in red right in the middle of the photo for scale. So these polygons are like between 10 and 30 meters in diameter. And in between the polygons, we have these ice wedge troughs over the ice wedges themselves. So these ice wedges form from repeated frost cracking in the winter, and then water infills the cracks in the summer and freezes the following fall. So over the course of decades and centuries, you get these laminated ice wedges growing in the subsurface. Now, as the Arctic is warming, these ice wedges are melting, and we can see there's this differential subsidence in the ice wedge troughs, where these troughs are getting deeper, they pool water, and we're getting changed surface hydrology, vegetation, all sorts of interrelated Earth system feedbacks happening in these landscapes. They're very complex systems. So there's been a lot of really excellent work done thus far with mapping in ice wedge landscapes, in particular focused on delineating the boundaries of the polygons. This is a figure from some of Chuck Abelt's work. I know Chandy is here and presented earlier this semester on some of his group's work with Pan-Arctic ice wedge mapping or polygon mapping. There's also been some cool work mapping the actual networks between these ice wedge polygons and looking at change over time. What I'm particularly interested in, though, is what is happening at a sub-polygon level. You know, we can have any one particular polygon, and it can be bounded by these different ice wedge troughs that have very different characteristics. There's a lot of heterogeneity in this landscape. So to further understand the meter scale complexity in these landscapes, I want to map the actual troughs themselves, which have different sizes and shapes, different patterns with water, vegetation, elevation that we haven't really captured fully before. So one way to conceptualize this variation in these ice wedge troughs is through identifying different degradation stages. So for the work I've been doing, we've been using this 5-stage classification scheme. So starting with undegraded on the left side, so an ice wedge that hasn't begun melting, progressing through 2 degradation stages where the ice wedge is actively melting, the surface is deforming, and then 2 stabilization stages where if you get a sufficient amount of organic matter, of insulating material over the ice wedge after degradation, it can actually start to stop melting, become more stabilized. Yeah, now these are really complex systems. You could do much more nuanced categories, and people have, but for the purpose of our mapping, we've stuck with these 5 stages. And here as a preview, this is the color scheme I'll be using with some of my maps. I will include legends, but just so you know for now. And so you can get a sense of what this looks like in the field. Here are a bunch of photos from a recent publication. And you can see right away there's clear differences in the size, the shape, the water present, the vegetation communities. So there's clearly like a surface signal showing the difference between these degradation stages. All right, so let's take a step back. Why do we care about these degradation stages in the first place? Well, we know that as ice wedges degrade, there is a whole host of interrelated feedbacks going on. Water, sediment, and heat are routed through the landscape in different ways, and just landscapes are very much changing through time. We also know that degradation changes the surface energy balance and the amount and form of carbon being released to the atmosphere. And so in order to better predict how the system is going to continue evolving, in order to better understand the permafrost carbon climate feedback, we really need a better sense of the distribution of these ice wedge landscapes and the different dynamics in play in these landscapes. So how do we detect different ice wedge degradation stages? Sort of the best practice is repeated coring. So going to an ice wedge and assessing whether it is melting through time, if it's stabilized, what exactly is going on with the ice itself. But this is, of course, really time consuming, and we're only able to do this at a few small study sites. So if we want to expand our understanding of these phenomena and spatial patterns to broader regions, we really need some new or improved remote sensing methods that will allow us to identify and detect degradation stages at broader scales. So this brings us to the multi-scale mapping that I've been working on, detecting these ice wedge troughs and then identifying their degradation stages. For this project, we focused on a study site on the Arctic coastal plain of Alaska. It's about 30 kilometers south of Prudhoe Bay, right along the Dalton Highway and the Sag River, you can see there. The site itself is about 12 by 30 kilometers, 30 or 40 kilometers. And this is our full regional scale site that we've done some of our satellite mapping at. And we also have 2 field sites where we collected a bunch of data and drone surveys that I'll talk about more in a moment. So yes, in the field, we collected data along transects, looking at vegetation, soil, water, topography. We also collected drone surveys with both a multispectral camera and a drone-based LiDAR system. So that gets us really super high resolution imagery and elevation data. And then, as I mentioned before, we're also working with some worldview imagery. So that's half-meter resolution imagery across this full kilometer scale site, or multiple kilometer scale site. So together with these 3 scales of data, we want to look at patterns in ice wedge degradation. But before we can get to assessing those patterns in degradation, we have to identify degradation stage. So for each individual ice wedge trough, what stage of degradation is it in? As I mentioned before, repeated coring is one of the main methods to do this, but other folks have done remote sensing work, mostly looking at time series data. So looking at how the landscape is changing through time, whether those troughs are degrading or stabilizing or not changing at all. There's also been some work looking at spectral analyses and elevation, or you can go out in the field and collect a variety of observational data that can help distinguish these stages as well. So for this project, we used a combination of remote sensing data and our field data to identify these degradation stages. We used, as I mentioned, multi-spectral drone imagery and LiDAR data. And with our high resolution imagery, I was able to digitize the boundaries of all of these troughs. Then I was able to identify the degradation stage for each trough. And then this was corroborated with our field data sets and spectral and topographic data, which we can talk more about at the end if that's of interest. So now that we have identified degradation stages, we can start thinking about our 2 research questions. First question was, how does ice wedge degradation vary over different spatial scales? Secondly, what landscape characteristics are associated with ice wedge degradation? So remember, these are highly heterogeneous landscapes, and capturing this subpolygon variability in ice wedge terrain is going to help us understand these systems, how they're changing through time, and help us better constrain like the permafrost carbon climate feedback as these ice wedge troughs degrade. So we're going to focus first on some of our drone mapping products and analysis from our southern study site. So this is a site with really well-connected ice wedge troughs, a lot of flooding. And after digitizing and identifying the degradation stages, we can see here that many of these ice wedge troughs are in that red advanced degradation stage. This is just a really awesome, rich data set. Just looking at it visually, you can see that these advanced degradation stages, where the ice wedge is really melting, lots of flooding, lots of vegetation changing compared to the undegraded stages. Those areas tend to be located at like the intersections between multiple troughs. And the other thing I'll point out with this map is that there are very few, if any, polygons that are surrounded by just one type of ice wedge degradation stage. There is a lot of meter scale variability in degradation stage. So a quick calculation reveals that 50% of the trough area at this site is in the advanced degradation stage, and the other troughs are split relatively evenly between undegraded and the initial degradation stage. One important piece of regional context that I want to point out is that this site, this whole area by the Dalton Highway, is known to have undergone a major degradation event about a decade ago. So this site in particular, it seems like hasn't had enough time for these troughs to progress from the degradation stages into the stabilization stages. We didn't see any evidence in the field. We don't see any evidence in our high resolution drone products that there's anything but these three degradation stages here. So we also, with this drone data set, are able to look at a variety of trough morphology and spectral characteristics by degradation stage. We looked at a bunch of different variables, but I'm going to highlight two in particular today. First is trough width. One sec. There we go. So looked at average trough width, which we're measuring from the edge to edge of the trough or rim to rim. And you can see all three degradation stages have significantly different average trough widths. It's increasing as degradation increases. We also looked at average trough near infrared. And for this variable, the undegraded and initial degradation stages have significantly higher average near infrared values than the advanced degradation stages, which corresponds to the fact that most of the advanced degradation stages are flooded and therefore have a lower near infrared value. So after finding out that these troughs do have distinct spectral and spatial characteristics, we wanted to use these patterns to examine larger regional trends in ice wedge degradation and to make a map of the regional ice wedge troughs. So first, I'm going to walk you through our processing workflow with the satellite data to make our ice wedge trough map, and then we're going to spend some time looking at a variety of spatial analyses that we did on the trough maps to examine degradation across the region. So we started with our worldview image. We pan sharpened it, so it's a 0.5 meter resolution. And then we masked out areas that did not contain any ligonal terrain. So things like open water, stuff by the river, and that was masked out using the NLCD, the land cover map. Then we used a raster differencing method to pick out the pixels that corresponded to the ice wedge troughs. So this is the same general method as a topographic position index, if you're familiar with that. If not, basically what you do is you take your raster, we were using the near infrared raster and the NDVI raster, and you smooth it with a moving window average. Then you subtract your original raster from this smooth raster, and the difference raster highlights pixels that are significantly different from like the local average values. So this tends to correspond with the trough pixels. For near infrared, this pulls out areas that are flooded, since we know that near infrared picks out water areas really well. And we also know from our drone data that we see this distinct pattern with the troughs as well. So the near infrared difference raster identified the flooded troughs. The NDVI difference raster identified the dry troughs. And we use this method because we know from previous work that there are different vegetation species at different elevations of the ice wedge troughs and polygons. So picking out areas with different values of NDVI compared to the, compared to the like local average is picking out these areas where the species is changing right on the boundaries of the troughs. So once we had our difference rasters, we pulled out those pixels corresponding to the troughs through pixel thresholding. And then with our resulting trough map, we did some cleaning, removing noise, also using morphological opening to smooth out the jagged edges of the troughs and to make them more cohesive, like the trough networks actually are on the ground. And then all of this produced our final 3-class trough map, which identified the flooded troughs, the dry troughs, and all other non-trough area. So once we had this map, we wanted to assess accuracy. We did this with 2 methods. The first was just looking at 500 different random points throughout the site and visually identifying the class in the satellite imagery. This had an accuracy of about 53%, so like not excellent, but not terrible either. And when you look at the sensitivity and specificity by class, we can see that the method is doing really quite well at picking out the flooded troughs. It's struggling more with distinguishing the dry troughs from the non-trough area. But if you are familiar with these features, a lot of these troughs are only about a meter or so wide. And when we're working with half-meter resolution data, there are going to be a fair number of troughs that we're just not going to be able to pick out with that similarity in size between the feature and our data. So the other accuracy assessment that we looked at was comparing our satellite map to our drone map to see, we know we're missing a lot of the smaller troughs. What exactly are we missing? So we found that our satellite map accurately identified 58% of the troughs or the trough area from our drone map. And when we break it down by class, as expected, we are mostly missing out on the undegraded and initial degradation troughs, which tend to be the narrower and more difficult to detect features. So now that we have this trough map for the full site, how are we going to estimate degradation stage? With our drone data, we went in and visually identified it, but obviously that's going to be impossible with such a large regional scale. So we're going to need to figure out some other method. So what we did is looking at some of our findings from our drone analysis. We know that average trough width increases throughout these 5 degradation stages, both from our work and from the literature. And we also know that trough hydrology, like the amount of surface water present, changes with these degradation stages. So we can exploit these relationships, the fact that these different troughs have different morphologies and different hydrologies, as an approach for estimating degradation stage. Because on average, an ice wedge trough in the undegraded stage, for example, is going to have a really narrow trough and very little water presence, whereas a trough in the stabilized advanced stage is going to be very wide with very little flooding. So I'm not saying that like every single trough is going to follow this pattern, but on average, these troughs should be falling into these hydrogeomorphology patterns that we can detect in our regional trough map. So what we did over our full site, and this is just a small portion here, we cast a 30-meter grid over the full site and looked at a bunch of summary statistics within each 30 by 30 meter cell. We looked at average trough width and the percentage of trough pixels within each cell that were flooded. Those are the two main variables that I'm going to talk about today. And so using these two data sets, we then classified each cell first according to the cell's average width, and second according to how much that cell was flooded. So together, this morphology and hydrology classification separates each of these cells into one of 5 hydrogeomorphic classes, which we are assuming relates to the dominant degradation stage within each cell. So when we conducted this classification across the full regional site, this is what we found. This is really interesting because there seems to be some really clear spatial patterns here in trough hydrogeomorphology. So what I wanted to do next with this analysis is assess whether there are real spatial patterns here. So what I did first is using the join count test to examine the site's spatial autocorrelation. If you're not familiar, spatial autocorrelation describes how a phenomenon is dispersed through a site. So if you have positive spatial autocorrelation, like the figure on the left, you see distinct clusters of values. Negative spatial autocorrelation would be more of a checkerboard pattern. And then no spatial autocorrelation is a random distribution of the phenomenon. So the joint count test uses binary data, so presence or absence of a feature, and it compares this distribution of binary data to many different permutations of randomly distributed data to examine whether your data set is more clustered or more dispersed than expected compared to the random distribution. So because this test used binary data, I conducted it 5 times, one for each of our hydrogeomorphic classes or degradation stage equivalents. And what I found is that all of these stages have strong positive spatial autocorrelation. So that means that all of our stages are significantly clustered through the site. So this was an exciting finding, but the join count test that I just talked you through does not actually identify where these clusters are. It just tells us that there is clustering present in this site. So you can look at this map and visually distinguish a few of them, but what I really wanted to do was figure out a way to identify the boundaries of these different clusters. So to do this, I used a tool called Anslin's Local Moran's Eye. It's another spatial statistic. And unlike the join count test, this one uses quantitative data, and it picks out different clusters of either high values or low values. So a high value cluster would be a pixel with a high value surrounded by other pixels that also have high values. Same but opposite for a low value cluster. And then it also identifies areas where there is no clustering presence because you have more of a random distribution of values. So I ran this tool on two input rasters. First, I looked at our summary statistic of percentage of flooding within each of those 30-meter cells. And so this map here shows that the areas in black, I have to move this so I can make sure I'm telling you right. Yes, black are low value clusters. So all those areas in black are places where the landscape has troughs that are more dry. And all of the areas in gray are portions of the landscape where most of the troughs are more flooded. I also ran this statistic looking at average trough width. So on this map, the black areas are places where most troughs are narrow. They have shorter average width, whereas the gray areas have wider troughs on average. And then the white areas are areas without any significant clusters. So once I have these two maps, I stacked them on top of each other to produce a final hydrogeomorphology cluster map, which identifies areas that have this statistically significant high or low flooding and trough width. So if we look at this in particular, the clusters that are orange are places that have mostly low width and low flooding troughs. Red are areas with low width troughs and high flooding, and so on. So these different clusters, if we continue with our assumption that these degradation stages align with the different types of morphology and hydrology, these clusters probably contain ice wedge troughs where most of those troughs are in these corresponding degradation stages. Obviously, there's going to be heterogeneity, but clearly our spatial statistics are picking up on some sort of patterns in trough hydrogeomorphology across the landscape. And here is just in reference to our original hydrogeomorphology class map. So as a reminder, we did collect field data at two sites. Both of them, even though you can't really tell in the top star, they both fall into that red class. So that's low width, high flooding, and corresponds to places we would expect to see a lot of troughs in the advanced degradation stage. And that is exactly what we saw in the field and in our drone data. This is the photo from our southern site, so right in this large red cluster. Half of the troughs at this site are in the advanced degradation stage. So unfortunately, we don't have field data from the other clusters at this site, but that is something we are planning to do in the future to assess whether this relationship between these hydrogeomorphology clusters and the actual trough degradation stages on the ground, like whether that is a pattern throughout this region. So for now, though, we have our remote sensing data to play with and some interesting questions left to consider. Namely, okay, we see this landscape scale clustering in trough hydrogeomorphology. What exactly is controlling this clustering? Why are we seeing more troughs in the advanced degradation stage, like right here, compared to other portions of the landscape? So this brings me to the last part of this talk, thinking about these landscape characteristics. So to get started answering this question, or at least addressing this question, we examined a number of terrain parameters and also spectral indices. The terrain parameters were based on the Arctic DEM. Spectral indices were from our worldview data. And we looked at the value of these different data sets within each of our hydrogeomorphology clusters. And what we found was that in particular, elevation and topographic position index, mean elevation, mean topographic position index, were significantly different between these different clusters. For spectral indices, we're not going to talk much about the spectral data today. It was interesting that it's the range in these spectral indices that differs between these clusters and not actually the mean values. So I think there's something going on here with different types of clusters have different amounts of heterogeneity within them. But for now, let's take a look at our elevation data. So here's a box plot looking at average elevation within the 4 clusters, and the site's overall average elevation is denoted with the dashed line. So there is a very clear pattern here. The red and light blue box plots, which correspond to our low width, high flooding and high width, high flooding clusters, the advanced degradation cluster and the initial stabilization cluster, those are the highest portions of the landscape. The lowest portions of the landscape, the orange box, are the low width, low flooding clusters. So those are areas where we would expect to see a lot of ice wedge troughs in the undegraded or initial degradation stage. This pattern is also upheld when we look at topographic position index. So this is not average elevation. Instead, topographic position index describes how one point compares in elevation to the local mean in a surrounding 500-meter radius. So a higher topographic position index, like the advanced degradation and initial stabilization stages, means those areas are higher on the landscape compared to their local vicinity. So we're still working with these data sets to continue teasing out these landscape patterns, but this is a first pass of analysis that shows there's definitely substantial heterogeneity in where degradation is occurring, and elevation appears to play a major role in these patterns. So with that, let's take a look at some of the key takeaways. First off, I think the multi-scale nature of our project was really essential because it helped us constrain the bias in our satellite mapping. And, going forward, any mapping of ice wedge troughs that is based on satellite data, I think you really need to consider what types of troughs you are missing and what that means for your analysis. Second, we also found clear variation in ice wedge degradation at different spatial scales. On the meter scale at our study sites, we found that one polygon can be surrounded by multiple degradation stages. There's very rapid differences in degradation at these sites. But then we also found that there is this coarse scale clustering where different portions of the landscape seem to have more troughs in one degradation stage compared to another. And our landscape analysis is starting to link that spatial clustering of degradation with these different characteristics, notably elevation and topography patterns. All right, so last slide, I just wanted to mention some of the things we're planning to do with these data and on these themes in the future. In particular, I'm interested in exploring the exact drivers of this landscape clustering, possibly through some statistical modeling, definitely through some more field sampling to see what's going on at those other types of clusters. We're also interested in how this regional clustering of degradation is impacting regional carbon dynamics through some carbon flux monitoring and upscaling work. And then finally, we're planning to update our regional scale trough mapping by using a GeoAI classifier to identify these ice wedge troughs to hopefully improve our mapping accuracy and speed up the classification process overall. All right, that's what I've got for you all today. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about this.
Wow, thank you, Katie. This is incredible work. No wonder you got your graduate research fellowship from NSF. Super cool. So please, you had questions for Katie. If you want to just unmute yourself or put your raise hand up or put it in the chat, it's you got all those three options. So I have questions, but I'm going to hold off and let others ask first. Questions are coming. Yeah. Don't be shy. All right, we got a hand. Ben.
Yeah, Ben has.
I'll volunteer. Great presentation, Katie.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, cool. Yeah. Do you have a sense for the variability in ponded surface water area in your troughs, like throughout the year or across years?
Mm-hmm. So we haven't started to incorporate that temporal aspect. I don't think I mentioned this, but we were looking at one set of satellite image. So no, not yet, but that's definitely something I'm interested in. We're going to do some temporal mapping for my PhD dissertation. Yeah.
Awesome. Good. Look forward to the updates then. Thanks.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask that too, actually, because the temporal, since this is a temporal, it's an evolutionary process, and perhaps including a temporal data set of the same area, maybe you can even make your mapping of the degradation stage even stronger, because things are following on in a certain order. So would that be something you will explore, perhaps, to incorporate looking at one trough over time and therefore use that as a check and make sure you are mapping the correct degradation stage?
Yes, definitely. You know, one of the things we struggled with was like, for some of these troughs, like, is it actually stabilized yet? And just from looking at it with one timestamp, it's kind of difficult, especially with this site, which seems to be mostly recent degradation. You really need that temporal aspect to validate whether, oh, this used to be far more degraded and has now shifted to a different stage versus it's just some variation of the advanced degradation stage. So yeah, that is definitely in the works. Yes.
Go for it, Matt.
Yeah, what you said about that sort of degradation event, I thought was really interesting. So you sort of indicated that there was an area that had sort of gone through a pretty rapid change. What sort of time periods do you think those happen over, and like what level of monitoring would you need to do in order to sort of have the temporal resolution in order to detect those sort of rapid changes in a specific area?
Yeah, so let's see, I can go back to my figure just so we can be looking at the stages. Let's see. Yeah, so from my understanding, like the onset of degradation, like moving from undegraded to the initial degradation or advanced degradation, can be as rapid as a year. You know, we're talking about yearly timescales, one particularly warm summer, even one particularly major precipitation event can really start that degradation. Moving from degradation to stabilization is more on the order of decades. So that's why I said this site really hasn't had time to move from here to here. That seems to be a longer process. And then moving from stabilization initial to advance, and then maybe even linking back up to undegraded, that's dashed because I'm uncertain whether that actually happens. That's more thinking about centuries. So I think we can definitely start looking at some of these stages and validating it with some like temporal mapping, looking at satellite data going back past 20 years or so. But we're definitely not going to be able to detect this sort of change just through mapping.
I remember a comment on that. So I was out with Tora at his site in Dead Horse, and he hadn't been there to that site in like a 5-year time period or something like that. And he came to one trough and he was like, am I in the right place? Because that trough had started to stabilize when he was there 5 years ago. He was in stabilization stage and it had sedges growing in it that was really happy. You know, sedges can only handle certain water depth of like 20, 30, 25 centimeters or so. But when we came back this time, the sedges were ghosts. They were dead deep in the water. So that site that had stabilized had then degraded again. So that was really exciting to see.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more complexity than this like nice linear diagram seems to imply. Definitely all sorts of things where you skip. It's very complex.
It makes it fun.
It does, yeah.
Let's see. Oh, so you have primarily worked now at Prudhoe Bay site. So are you planning on trying this at some couple of other sites in Alaska or the Arctic? Because I know when Shandi was developing his ice wedge polygon model, when he moved to a different site, he had to retrain his model because the ice wedge polygon diameter was much larger there. So the deep learning method he used wasn't picking them up. So yeah.
Yeah, we're planning to go to Utqiagvik this summer to do some drone mapping there, and yeah, continuing this sort of work. And yeah, I've only been to Prudhoe Bay personally, so I can't give you any like personal experience, but I'm very interested to see whether or not these patterns are upheld in other sites. Is this site specific? You know, what exactly is going on?
Go for it, when.
Oh, I think Ben also have a question. Ben, do
Yeah,
you want to go first?
You first. He already asked once, so he can ask after
Yeah,
you.
go ahead, Wen.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. Well, thanks so much, Katie, for the very interesting talk. My work is on the GLAI side, so I have learned a lot from your presentation today. And I'm also very interested in capturing the temporal changes of the degradation. And you mentioned you use the Maxar world wheel images. If we want to look at the temporal changes, do you have any satellite image in mind that we can use?
We were planning to continue using Worldview. Yeah, that work is just starting to be planned, so I don't really have many more details yet. I'm writing my thesis right now. That's got a lot of my attention. But yeah, that's our plan for now, sticking with Worldview.
Cool. Well, congratulations on your award.
Thank you.
Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, one more question, Katie. Are you able to image the depth of the water bodies in the troughs? Can you actually get like the total subsidence associated with ice wedge degradation?
Yeah, so that's a separate project that we worked on a little bit earlier this year. But with the drone structure from motion, when the water is really clear, it actually does do a pretty good job of capturing the elevation, or I guess the bathymetry of those ponds. And so looking at the total volume of subsidence is something we're planning to do. Yeah. But I think you need
good. I'm glad you've also discovered that you can do that with the structure for motion stuff. Yeah, I was working on some data at Prudhoe Bay, and I thought it was just a bunch of noise, but actually turns out there is a signal there if the water's clear and it's not too windy.
Yeah, you need pretty perfect conditions, but we got lucky. Mm-hmm.
Cool. And one more just comment building on Anna's comment about adding additional field sites. It'd be kind of neat to add a hill slope site to your work, and just see where, maybe where this scheme right here breaks down if slope is involved.
I would imagine it would be very different. Like this site is very much a plain. So I'm not sure if that elevation pattern would be preserved with degradation stage at a hill slope, but I agree it would be really interesting to see what's going on there.
Yeah, I encourage you, like Yago out in Anwar, which is where Misha and Tora and Yuri have worked. And we're going back out there on a new NSF grant. And that would be a really cool site to do it at, because the paper that you cited, the new paper from Tora, it's showing us new drainage channels in the ice wedge troughs. And I think Ben is spot on. Like as soon as you get a slope and you get a drainage channel, a trough that represents a stream network, you might not get to the advanced stabilization stage because the water is draining away instead of ponding around.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, so that might be a good candidate site for exploring your method on landscapes that you have better lateral drainage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So any more thoughts or questions from people? Maybe we also have, I don't know if someone from the Permafrost Discovery Gateway development team wants to share something that's relevant to this, or I know Ben has a really cool map that he just showed earlier this week in another project meeting, and that's relevant to this with elevation change, but I'm not sure he's ready to share about it. If you're up for it, Ben, I think it would be really cool. But
sorry, I sneezed there for a sec. What was that, Anna? You want me to share show some of this? You want me to share my screen?
Yeah, I want, if you're up for it,
Let me
share your
definitely.
screen and the analysis that you've done with elevation difference of 2 years, 2012 or 2020, whatever it was, that shows how the elevation change within the troughs and the ice wedge polygon there in Dead Horse. I thought it's just a really cool, what Katie just talked about, and what you came up with there, I think is super complementing, because Katie, you were talking about how you can have one ice wedge polygons and all these different degradation stages, stabilization stages around that polygon, and Ben has some really cool LiDAR results.
Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If you don't mind, Katie, I can show some stuff from one of Tor's sites there at Prudhoe. So this is work that's actually part of an NSF-funded project to Dr. Skip Walker at UAF. It's his ice-rich permafrost systems NNA project. And so within this area that I flew a UAV survey back in August 21, there's a number of transect points here, a number of plot points where they've been looking at vegetation kind of changes over time, as well as quantifying biomass on terrestrial part of the tundra, as well as in the ponds and the aquatic vegetation that's growing there. So I basically flew this survey to support more this ground kind of vegetation botany type studies. But I don't know what your biggest UAV survey is, Katie, but this one was about I think it was like a 16 battery UAV survey. So pretty big survey. Took me all day sitting on top of this Pingo right here. I guess, yeah, just a quick background. The way I do the UAV survey is I set out my Leica GPS base station first, and I occupy a site. So this site I occupied for about 7 or 8 hours, I believe. And then at the end of the day, I send that base station file to NGS Opus to get the Opus correction. And so then I can go back out the next day, and I have a base station for my small quadcopter. And so I can just go ahead and enter the post-processed base station file from the Leica into the drone base station. And then that way my drone just automatically operates as in RTK mode. So technically speaking, no real need for post-processing, since we already know what the location is here where I set up the base station. But yeah, getting to your point, Katie, so it became apparent. I thought it was a bunch of noise in the data at first, but if the water was clear enough, and there wasn't much of a wind and there wasn't like a ripple on the water surface, I was actually imaging to the bottoms of the ice wedge troughs that had water in them. So this is just a transect at one of Skip's sites. He calls the T2 site there off of Spine Road in Dead Horse. And then just another example from a small pond where pretty much we're getting the bathymetry of the pond plus or minus about 10 centimeters or so. And then I looked at what we're mapping in terms of the water body pond depths in the UAV versus what we can measure in the field with the survey GPS. And there's a pretty good relation there that we can use to kind of correct whatever issues going on there with light interacting with the water column. And so knowing all that, I was able to do a differencing between the UAV survey DSM and Tor's terrestrial LiDAR survey from 2012. And in this survey, he did terrestrial LiDAR scans here in this area, but then he also switched his instrument over to total station mode and was able to image the bottoms of the ice wedge trough ponds to get the actual elevation of the bottom of the feature. And so assuming that we're seeing through the water with the UAV and then differencing a terrain model from the 2012 data set, we start to see some pretty cool patterns here where the blues are lower elevations. So that's areas that subsided between 2012 and 2021. But then there's also a lot of increases in elevation in the actual ice wedge trough ponds over that time, which I also thought was noise initially. But there was a master's student working on on a project focused on the aquatic biomass in these trough ponds with Skip, Emily Watson Cook. And it's pretty cool that a lot of these plots that she was actually working on, she's measuring emergent vegetation heights of 58 centimeters, emergent vegetation heights of 25 centimeters in 2021 and 2022 that just simply wasn't there in 2012. And so we're actually imaging, the growth of these aquatic plants, as well as in part probably permafrost degradation, as the system switches from that advanced degradation to the initial stabilization phases. So anyway, that's all I got now. I just kind of worked on this on Sunday for a meeting that we had on Monday. So that's as much thought as I've put into it so far.
Thank you for sharing, Ben, because this is so cool. And Katie, yeah, what do you think? Any thoughts or comments? What you just saw?
Well, that's awesome. I'll be thinking about this. Cool data.
Yeah, definitely. It looked like in one of your UAV images there, you could actually see those aquatic plants in the ice wedge trough ponds. So yeah, keep an eye on those things. They're pretty important.
I will do.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. I will stop the recording here.